This podcast is brought to you by A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London Middlesex, both family owned and operated. By the Diocese of Huron, a community where families and individuals from Windsor to Owen Sound, Grand Bend to Port Rowan come together to worship and serve. And by Molly Maid. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. Today, we welcome Lerita Coleman Brown. Lerita is a spiritual director / companion, author, retreat leader, and speaker. Her newest book is What Makes You Come Alive? A Spiritual Walk with Howard Thurman. We'll chat about the book and so much more on the Vicar's Crossing.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever and wherever you may be listening. We welcome you back to another edition of the Vicar's Crossing podcast. The Vicar's Crossing is a virtual space where faith intersects with the public square. And we're so glad to have you aboard as we continue our season 8 of the Vicar's Crossing and our third episode. And once again, I'm Rob Henderson from Holy Trinity St. Stephen's.
How are you today, Rob? I'm Kevin. Kevin George, rector at, what is that now? St. Aidan's Church up in northwest corner of London. Glad to be with you today.
That's where you are. And we're glad to be back together and glad that we can invite another guest into the program. Really looking forward to talking to this lady. Lerita Coleman Brown is our guest. And Lerita is an embodied spirit. She's an author. She's a speaker. She's a former psychology professor, and we'll talk a little bit about her personal story, a heart and kidney transplant recipient as well, which was just an amazing story behind all that. And she's got a book out about a gentleman that you may be familiar with or not. And if you're not, we certainly would encourage you to stay with us today. What Makes You Come Alive? A Spiritual Walk with Howard Thurman. And Howard Thurman is just a giant in the spiritual world, and was a spiritual advisor to Martin Luther King Jr. as well at one point. So, and he's done a lot of writing. And so anyway, this book walks the reader through his life and talks about how, we can encounter the natural world and pay attention to things like sacred synchronicity, how things connect to each other, how we can unleash our inner authority, how we can recognize the genius of the religion of Jesus as we walk with him. So, so anyway, we'll talk to Lerita coming up here in just a minute.
Yeah, incredible book. I think you'll all enjoy it. We want to begin today, as we always do, with our land acknowledgement. We want to acknowledge that the place from which this podcast originates is our original lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenapehoik, and Attawandaron peoples, and are connected with the London Township and Sombre Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. These lands continue to be home to diverse Indigenous peoples whom we recognize as contemporary stewards of this land and vital contributors of our society. We long to work and walk side by side with our siblings towards reconciliation, and for us to own the ways that we have broken these relationships.
We want to take a moment, too, to thank our sponsors, those that support our podcast, and we are so appreciative of their time with us. First, to A. Millard George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London Middlesex, both family owned and operated. Dave Mullen's been a great support, and we want to say hi to Dave and all the staff today at A. Millard George.
And we want to extend our gratitude to the Diocese of Huron, a community where families and individuals from Windsor to Owen Sound, from Grand Bend to Port Rowan come together to worship and serve. A couple of those communities represented right here at Holy Trinity St. Stephen's with Rob and St. Aidan's here. And we're thankful to Bishop Todd Townsend for his support of the work that we're doing as well.
All right. And also to Molly Maid. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. Our thanks to Tricia Listar for her support and for keeping us clean.
She certainly knows how to clean up. Yes, very good. She knows how to clean up. She can clean us up. Yeah,
that's right. All right. So let's get to Lerita. I know she's waiting from, I got to ask her about this, Stone Mountain, Georgia. Doesn't that just sound like a picture you want on your wall?
Yeah.
Stone Mountain, Georgia.
I feel like it's a sort of place that you could be, and then you walk down from there and go to Augusta.
Yeah,
and watch Tiger play some golf.
Watch the Masters. I love it. I love it. Anyway, she's waiting in Stone Mountain, so let's bring her in now.
Come on in, Lerita.
Lerita Coleman Brown is here and our guest today on the Vickers Crossing podcast. And Lerita, we're so happy that you could spend some time with us to talk about your book and other things. How are you? And welcome aboard.
Thank you. I'm doing very well, and I'm excited to be
Yeah.
a part of your podcast.
Well, you've
Great.
come to Canada, right, Rob?
That's right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I don't know why we didn't think of that.
Yeah. You're in Stone Mountain, Georgia, which just the sound of that sounds beautiful. Stone Mountain. I'm trying to picture it in my mind, but how are things there? I'm sure it's a beautiful place.
It is. There's a little history with the Stone Mountain, but that's a whole nother
Oh, is that
conversation.
another podcast? Okay.
Absolutely. But it's a beautiful town. You know, we're sort of northeast of the city of Atlanta, so you have access to the larger city when you want to, but when you don't, you can enjoy Stone Mountain and Stone Mountain Park. It's actually a state park with lots of trees and paths and places to bicycle and water, fish, all of that.
Yeah. And with the work that you do and the ministry you do, I was picturing Stone Mountain as a beautiful place for retreat for people like Kevin and I need to get away. We
need to go to Georgia.
Stone Mountain. Yeah, go to Georgia.
Yeah,
that'd be great.
And maybe you could hook us up. We could talk to Stacey Abrams too. She's from that area. Yeah.
We're not best friends, but you know, I might be able to call some people who can call some people.
Your people
right,
in touch with her people. What I really like before we get into all that, what I really like about Stacey Abrams is she's a testimony to what one person can do.
Yes.
Because I think she single-handedly during that presidential election just sort of willed the people to get out and vote and just did so much. And born out of her Christian witness too, I think.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Fantastic. Well, look, there's lots to talk about today. Congratulations on the book. It was really a joy to read it. It was great to learn more about Howard Thurman. But before we get into the book itself, among other things like spiritual director and blogger and speaker, and you're writing plays now, and I think I see behind you stuff for sewing.
Yes.
And
right.
I think you're doing everything is what I think. But among all of that, you're a strong advocate for organ donation, and you have a very good reason to be a strong advocate for organ donation, because if I'm reading right, you are the recipient of both a kidney and a heart.
Yes, but not at the same time.
No, okay. Well, that would have been a bit much. Now, in describing your blog, Peace for Hearts, which is, by the way, if you need a place to go and read beautiful material on contemplative spirituality and all that, I commend you to Peace for Hearts. But you write this: what helped me to survive my heart transplant was recognizing that I needed to make a change in heart, not only a physical one, but the deeper one lying at the core of who I am. I possessed a type A personality, was driven, highly competitive, hostile, and angry at anyone who might thwart my personal accomplishments. Now I understand I blocked the naturally loving, peaceful, compassionate, and joyful heart we are each born with. I needed to recover the awareness of the peace and joy in my heart that I had lost on my way to achieving success, quote unquote. I am called to assist all who are ready to uncover the peace and joy that lies buried in their hearts, because in the end, it's what's in your heart that counts. And I agree. It's not every day that a type A, very successful professor and academic steps back or gets off the ladder of upward mobility, if you will, and walks away from what many see as you say, quote unquote, success, and becomes a contemplative, a spiritual director, a playwright, a storyteller. Your story, Lerita, to me embodies what Henry Nouwen wrote about when he talked about downward mobility. This business of being able to sort of take the road of Jesus, if you will, in the sense of not worrying about what other people think or what success looks like, but what really feeds the soul. Can you talk to us about how your change of heart moment led to a change of heart moment? A change of heart was a change in heart for you, a new life. Can you talk to us about that?
Yes. Well, it's now been 28 years since the heart transplant.
Wow. Great heart. You got a great heart. 28 years.
Well, but I think that the spiritual work that I've done contributes to the longevity of the heart and my still being here.
Yeah.
But I felt like I was destined to have a heart transplant.
Mm.
I mean, I'm in a body with a genetic composition that I was going to have a heart transplant, whether I wanted one or
Whether you
not.
wanted one or not.
That's right. So, that was just startling in itself, right? To
Yeah, I
just think,
bet.
okay, you are destined to do this. But it was a great disruption into my thinking, my socialization, all of these ideas about personal achievement, which certainly is of high priority, particularly in the United States. I don't know about other places, but you're supposed to grow up and go out and make a name for yourself. I was on that track, and I think before the transplant, I sort of had a sense that I was miserable and I really didn't want to continue to grind out, articles, et cetera. But the transplant, as Richard Rohr would say, it's either great suffering or great love that, leads to a spiritual awakening.
Amen. Yeah.
So going through that and living through that and having mystical experiences along the way,
I bet,
helped me to understand that what I thought was my calling or my life was really not that. To be a successful professor of psychology. And I remember actually having that experience probably maybe 6 weeks or so before the transplant. I was having my own Garden of Gethsemane experience. House, like, why me? I just was single. I was like, how am I going to do this? And how am I going to? And this voice inside of me said, well, why not you?
Right.
What, you think you're here to be the next Freud?
There's been a Freud, there's been a Hans
Kuhn.
There's
been a Carl Jung. It's all been it.
Yes, exactly. So perhaps this is not why you're here.
Right.
So step up.
Yeah.
Right. It was kind of like step up and assume your role. In the larger plan. I mean, again, startling, but certainly very effective.
And tell me, I mean, I have to think too that, like, there's a real. I mean, I just can't imagine how you face that without facing your own mortality too, right? Like, there must have been a real sense that you might not survive this.
Yes, except that. There's a previous book, right? And that book is When the Heart Speaks, Listen, Discovering Inner Wisdom, which are a series of conversations that I had with my old and new hearts. And so my old heart basically prepped me, said, now, you don't have to do this, but if you don't, then this is the end.
We're done.
I'm really ready for that.
Yeah.
And I just sort of felt like choosing not to have the transplant when the team had basically said, look, there's nothing else wrong with you.
Right.
You're, healthy. So
you were young. You must have been very young.
Well, not that young, but young.
Yeah.
So they were saying, there's no reason for you not to have this transplant. So I must admit, when they first told me, I was hysterical and totally terrorized. Because I was sort of like, wait, let me get this straight. You're going to take my heart out.
I know.
That belongs to somebody I don't know.
That's right.
The thought of that in itself is.
And then is it later on that you get a kidney?
Yeah. So
okay, and a little later on, we're going to give you a kidney too.
Well, actually, I had a lot of rejection. And some of that has to do with where I had my transplant and the protocols that they use for treating rejection.
Yes.
And so it got to the point where at one point, I guess it was in 2003, I was in the hospital in pretty bad rejection. And they basically said, look, we're going to be able to save your heart. We're going to have to kill your kidneys to do it. So the medications that we give you for this.
Right.
So I didn't believe them. I was like, oh yeah, okay, whatever. But 6 months later, I was begging for dialysis, right?
I bet. So I mean, not to put too fine a point on it, but if you're listening to this or watching this and you haven't considered organ donation, I think you should look at Lerita here and know 30 years on, what a gift.
Yes.
What a gift, right?
Oh, yes. And I am in contact with my, and I name her in the book, Jody's brother. She has an older brother, one older brother still living. I actually just talked to him last week.
Wow. That's got to be an incredible experience.
Yeah. And so I got a chance to meet him, and not initially. Initially, the family was kind of like, this is too weird for us. But later I got to meet him, and he's just, for me to, to have published another book. He's just really excited, and it's just hard to describe, really. There's probably no words, really.
There are no words. And so, sign your donor cards, folks. I mean, it's a gift to the people you give it to. It's also a gift to your family, as you say, like Jody's family get to see what you're doing, and I'm sure that gives them great hope as well. So
yes.
Well, it wouldn't be right if we didn't talk about Howard Thurman and the book. And so this incredible book, there you go, hold it up. Mine's in my I should have mine out. Yeah. What makes you come alive? And I love that quote of his too. What makes you come alive? And so I wanted to start really where you started, in a sense, which is you describe yourself as someone who was born to be contemplative. That sort of started in you, is what you've discovered, what you've discerned over your lifetime. You began exploring spiritual direction and learning more and more about the mystics and the great spiritual writers, and you noted that you wondered where the African or African American mystics were. You weren't seeing any of those, and so like, where are these people? And so you write, and I'll just share this quick quote: "They must exist somewhere in the history of the world," you wrote. "So why hadn't I encountered any Black contemplatives in my studies? Why was I often the only Black person in the room at spiritual direction trainings and workshops or on silent retreats? I prayed to Spirit to direct me to a wisdom teacher in whom I could see my psychological, racial, and spiritual reality reflected. A pastor, a friend of yours, turned your attention to Howard Thurman. I feel confident, Lerita, that if you, throughout your adult life, an African-American woman who had attended predominantly Black churches across the country and had participated in spiritual retreats all over the place, could note that Thurman's name remained absent from all of those conversations that you were a part of, there may be a good many listeners of ours, or those who view this on YouTube, who may also have never heard of this great American treasure. So before we go too deep into the book, share with our readers a snapshot of who this spiritual giant was and what it was like for you to discover this Black voice was out there."
I don't know where to begin, except for to say that he was actually born a mystic. There's no doubt in my mind. He was having mystical experiences outside at 7.
Yes.
Wow.
Meditating underneath the oak tree.
Oh, the oak tree, yeah.
At 7 or 8 years old. And I do believe that there are some people that are born mystics, and that's just something that's a part of them that they bring into the world. And so he seemed to have this great connection to presence, divine presence, not only outside, but that was sort of initially where I think he discovered it, but in other places as well. So, but he was also a very bright child, and he lost his father when he was 7, and the local church did not want to host his father's funeral because he was not a churchgoer, and so they basically said, well, he's died out of Christ, and so
Good Lord deliver us.
Right. Yeah, right. Yeah, so and he's confused, thinking, wait, my father, my papa was a good man. And so what's up with this, just because he didn't go to church on Sunday doesn't mean that he wasn't. And isn't that more important, character?
Oh yeah.
Right? But that event was really instrumental in some of his other later work. But nonetheless, he did very well in school. He had his grandmother, who was probably his first mentor, Lady Ambrose, Nancy Ambrose, who taught him and kept telling him and his sisters one particular story over and over again. She had been born a slave. And so she said that once a year, a slave preacher used to come and give them a sermon. And at the end, he would look at each one of them in the eyes and say, you're not a slave and you're not the N-word. You are a holy child of God.
Mm-hmm.
And she said, that's what kept her together.
Mm-hmm.
And he did not forget that story.
Mm-hmm.
Because then I think his identity or sources of his identity were shifting to being a child of God.
Mm-hmm.
He in Daytona Beach, Florida at the time, Black students were only allowed to matriculate up to the 7th grade, basically de facto eliminating them from going to high school because you had to have an 8th grade certificate. So the community came together and had him privately tutored by the local principal so that he could pass that exam and go on to the Florida Baptist Academy. And he excelled there, graduating valedictorian of his class, which then enabled him to receive a scholarship to Morehouse College here in Atlanta, a men's college. And he then graduated valedictorian of his class, and it said that he read every book in the library at the time.
Oh,
Sure, that's
yeah.
But and while during that time, one summer he took a course at Columbia University in philosophy, and they really wanted him to come back and teach, but he really sensed that he had this call to the ministry. He had been conflicted about it because of the incident with his father.
Yes.
And he really didn't want to betray him, but he basically kept having these mystical experiences, as well as he says much later, I think when I was born, God put a coal in my heart. I was his man and there was no escape.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So then he goes on to the Colgate Rochester Seminary, where he graduates valedictorian of his class.
Yes.
And he had a particular professor who wanted him, who basically told him, this race thing, it's just going to pass. It's like I think you should focus on the timeless hunger of the human spirit. And, Thurman kind of looked at him and went, so, but
yeah.
he decided to work on both fronts at the same time.
Right.
Wow.
So he finished, he began a pastorate of the Mount Zion Baptist Church in Oberlin, Ohio. That was his first assignment. But while there, one night he was attending a religious education conference or something, and he got bored and walked outside and bought a couple of books, and one of them happened to be Finding the Trail of Life, which was written by the eminent Quaker mystic Rufus Jones.
Yeah.
And Rufus Jones is basically describing Thurman's childhood experiences. So he said, got to study with this man. I don't know how it's going to happen. And, as in the book, I have a chapter on sacred synchronicity.
Yes. Yeah.
So somehow or other, he got to Rufus Jones and was able to study with him for a semester, mysticism. And he didn't know, he had been having these experiences, but he didn't know that there was a formal area in theology that just focused on mysticism.
Yeah.
And he got to study all the mystics,
And he goes on to become very important in the life of Martin Luther King Jr. and in fact knew his parents. Yeah.
Yes. Knew them well. His second wife, his first wife died of tuberculosis, but his second wife actually was a roommate with Alberta King in high school.
Right. So
it was almost like the setup had started even before there was a thought of Martin Luther King Jr. But he did mentor him quite a bit. They crossed over at Boston University, and Thurman had begun to think about and write about Jesus as a leader of a nonviolent religion, really in the late 20s and early 30s. And then he goes and has this meeting. He goes to India on a pilgrimage and has this meeting with Gandhi.
Yeah, amazing.
Yes, it is. It's just
incredible.
The circumstances. And so Gandhi basically says, hey, look, I think you should start small and work yourself up to, non-cooperative, activities. And so shortly after that, when he returned, he started writing about that and encouraging people. And people started engaging in sort of what they call nonviolent direct action, even before the Civil Rights Movement. Yeah. And so there was some action going on. And then, of course, he publishes Jesus and the Disinherited, which is a book I believe every single person should read.
Agree.
It's a
Yeah.
classic.
Yeah.
Classic.
Yeah.
But he publishes that book, and there's lots of people who then meet Thurman on the page, and they're like ready
Yeah.
because it's like a blueprint for the civil rights.
I can just say that, like, I mean, we use that book in a program called Education for Ministry here. And, you know, like every year that we present that book to people, it just cracks open so much. It's unbelievable. So
I wanted to just quick quote from something that Thurman wrote. And I really like this because I think it's the work of the Spirit that I got this question, because this is something that I'm just terrible at. He talks about learning to be quiet, right? Learning to be quiet. He wrote, "We must learn to be quiet, to settle down in one spot for a spell. Sometime during each day, everything should stop, and the art of being still must be practiced. For some temperaments, it will not be easy because the entire nervous system and body have been geared over the years to activity, to overt and tense functions. Nevertheless, the art of being still must be practiced until development and habit are sure." That really spoke to me. And I feel like this is true more now than ever because, of course, we live in a culture that is absolutely obsessed with constant movement, nonstop entertainment. I mean, I'm having a conversation here and I'm quite wary that my phone's here flashing, and those of us in the church are notoriously bad at this too. Many good Christians don't even see silence or stillness as a prayer. And many associate silence and meditation as practices maybe to be associated with Eastern religions. But you write this in the book, Lerita, and I really like this. You write, "Listening is prayer. When I explained to those on retreat or spiritual companions that prayer is not a monologue, but a dialogue, and that I believe our Creator wants to commune with us, they are often surprised. And like me, they were taught specific forms of prayer, such as petitionary prayer, intercessory prayer, prayers of gratitude, and prayers of contrition. To pause, be still, and listen, they're not sure that even counts. And I often remind people that the words silent and listen contain exactly the same letters, just rearranged." That's amazing. One must be silent to truly listen. And Thurman, in fact, wrote about how quiet listening in the presence of God is as essential to eating and drinking. Can you talk more about this, especially for those of us, I think, Kevin and I come from these liturgical backgrounds, being in the Anglican or Episcopal Church, and these forms of intercessory prayer and all that is just ingrained into us. So the silence listening is sometimes a struggle. Can you talk more about that? Because it is so important.
Certainly, your initial reading was from the meditation Lull in Doing. It's one of my favorites. So that's what I recognized as you were reading. That was it. And it's from the book Meditations of the Heart. Yes, Thurman felt like silence and especially stilling one's self was healing. And so he noticed, for example, and he was particularly into congregational silence or group silence.
Yeah.
And I think he sort of learned a little bit about that when he was studying with Rufus Jones, and he attended some of the Quaker unprogrammed meetings. And he noticed that when he was really into it, that he lost a sense of himself and he joined all the other seekers in the room as one entity.
Right.
So, but when he founded the first intentional interracial church, the Church of the Fellowship of All Peoples in San Francisco, he had started sort of, I don't want to say playing around, but more kind of experimenting, because he was a great innovator, right? So he had been writing these meditations that you see and read now for these moments of silence during the worship service, but also people wanted more silence before the worship service. And he found that once he instituted the meditation time before the service, requests for pastoral care went down.
Oh, wow.
And he says that somewhere in all of that stillness, people are illuminated as to whatever problems they were having. And so they didn't have to come to him to talk.
Yeah.
I think there is something really powerful about congregational silence. And if there's any wish or hope that I have, is that somehow or other, even if it has to be kind of secretly snuck in some way,
Mhm.
but that congregations take some time to be still.
Yeah.
Thurman, by the way, did distinguish between being still and being quiet.
Mhm.
Okay.
He was very high on he'll sometimes say, can you be still enough? Not just quiet, but still enough.
Right. Still enough.
To hear the sound of the genuine. That was one of his famous lines, right?
Yeah.
And he says in Psalm 46:10, God doesn't say, be quiet and know that I am God. He says, be still,
Yes.
know that I am God.
Yeah. Be
Right.
still and know that I'm God.
And if you begin to practice stillness, or even listen for it outside or wherever it happens to be, because it's around us all the time,
Right.
just that our nervous systems are so
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, exactly.
habituated to activity, right?
Hyperactive here. You're
Yeah.
talking to a guy who can't sit still.
Yeah.
So if you can still yourself, you immediately can feel the presence around you.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
which is why he wanted people to practice the discipline. Can you cultivate the discipline of being still?
Right. And congregational stillness is something that
Yes.
it's not natural for us, for sure. I mean, I don't know if Kevin, you experienced this,
same.
but
Yep.
if I leading, how many hundreds and hundreds of liturgies have we led where we stopped and before we continued, and you can feel the energy in the room, like people are just wanting to move. So congregational stillness has to be taught and practiced as well. It's not something, you can say to a congregation in a group, we're going to do this for the next 6 months at this point, and
Yeah.
we're going to be really quiet, and we're not going to get it at first.
Yeah.
But it's so important to learn that, isn't it?
Well, okay, so you start small with maybe a minute.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you do it for a particular period of time, maybe just Lent
Yeah.
or
Mhm.
Advent.
Mhm.
Yeah.
You can kind of set the parameters around it just to ease people into it.
Yeah.
Because yes, if you were to say, okay, we're going to sit for 15
Yeah.
minutes,
Yeah.
people
No,
would be running out
that's
the
right.
door.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. Now that you're saying that, Rob, I could think of times where I've left an inordinate for what we think an inordinate period of silence, and there are certain people I can see staring at me
Mhm.
as if to say, "Is he okay? Like,
Yeah, he's okay.
is he having a
Should
mental
should we go
breakdown?
up there?
Is there is Kevin having a stroke right now? Because he's been silent. He's been silent for a minute and a half,
Yeah.
and I'm not sure what's going on here."
Well, I've been engaged in an experiment with a friend, because the other aspect of silence that Thurman focused on was called creative silence.
Mm.
So he used to sit he would meet someone in the silence. They were in a different part of the country,
Yeah.
but they would synchronize their time zones.
Interesting.
And
So
they
they'd
would
be in
meet
totally different places.
Yes, meet
Yeah.
in the silence, once a week.
Wow.
So for Lent, I have a partner, and we are meeting in the silence once a week.
Good for you.
And then just, if there's something that we notice while we're sitting in the silence, we just kind of jot it down, and we will we will talk about it, after Easter.
Beautiful.
Yep.
But my vision is that, if we could get people doing that all over the place,
I know.
everybody get a partner.
Imagine.
Imagine. And Thurman is, there's wonderful archives of his sermons. Right now, the best source, I think, is the Pitt Library at Emory University, because you can get audio transcriptions as well as, the written form. But in one sermon, he talks about the Essenes, and he says, they weren't trying to escape. They were just trying to get up under the structure that kind of imploded with their contemplative practices.
That's right.
Yep. One of the chapters you mentioned about sacred synchronicity, and you ask a series of questions in there. And so I just want to offer again a short quote from the book where you write, and this is a great question. Has a person ever suddenly appeared to you with exactly what you need? Has a chance encounter or what seemed like happenstance changed your life? Have you ever opened a book to a phrase or a word that solves a problem or illuminates what has been obscure? Are crazy coincidences just that, coincidence? Or are they proof of God's intervention? Great questions to meditate on.
Mhm.
And you write about how Howard Thurman frequently felt himself to be the beneficiary of these uncanny coincidences. And as he reflected on his life, he found it full of the presence and power of God. His views on divine intervention, however, offer a way out of kind of a simplistic claim that, God ordains everything, everything on the one hand, or that everything happens by chance on the other hand. He presents it, as you do, as more complex than that. And I wonder if you might share a couple of stories, one of these maybe, that illustrate this. There's one about Thurman and his trip to India, which you mentioned, and his meeting with Gandhi, and the other about your own decision to turn down a job. That was kind of interesting too.
Both of those stories are incredible.
Yeah.
So now, do you want me to talk about an incident from Thurman or incident from me?
Give us both, because both of those stories are great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That I was thinking of that story of Thurman trying to find Gandhi, because it's not today where you could just text him up.
Right.
Right.
On Twitter.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
Well, but the other turning point was for him was at the train station.
Right.
Where, he's all ready to go to the Florida Baptist Academy. He's got this little trunk.
Yes.
And, it's too heavy to be able for him to use on the ticket that he bought. And so he's just distraught and he's just sitting down crying.
Mm-hmm.
And he, this was a Black gentleman who basically was a workman. And he said, "Boy, what you crying about?" And he opened his eyes and saw this big Black man. And he said, "Oh, I'm trying to go to school," or whatever. And he said, "Well, come on." And, he pays for his ticket.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, that to me is just, extraordinary.
Mm-hmm.
And so he's got a series of those kinds of things where, or, when he's on his way out to start this new church and he runs into some guy who on the train who offers him, some space and turns out to be a public relations person who does all their public for the new church. I mean, so
and he ends up. The other one is the letter he wants to write to Gamble. Tell folks about that.
Oh yes, that one where he's really struggling to pay for his room and board because he was really driven, and it comes up all the time where he just gets exhausted. But so when his mother saw him after his first year of college, she was like, "You cannot continue to do what you're doing. So you're going to have to stay on campus." But he couldn't afford it. So he was trying to figure out, what can I do? He was shining shoes, he was riding his bicycle down the street. And some woman comes out of her house and says, "Hey, I want you to mail these letters for me. You look like you could be trustworthy." So he takes the letters and one of them is addressed to Gamble,
of Procter and Gamble fame.
Procter and Gamble,
Procter
yes.
and Gamble, yeah.
And he writes him and says, "Hey, I need some help." And he basically helped him, finish his high school. He gave him like a little grant, a scholarship.
And how that relates to your story, because I think the story about you in Colorado is quite interesting.
Oh yes, so I started. I don't know. I was trying to remember when I started actually giving decisions or engaging in discernment, giving decisions to the Spirit. But I noticed that my decisions turned out much better when I actually asked, right?
Yeah.
So this was really an extraordinary situation. I had been offered a job at Swarthmore College, which was really on my short list of places to always teach.
Yeah.
Very smart students, et cetera. I interviewed, they offered me a job, but there was something in me that said, I think you need to sit with this. So I go off to the Smoky Mountains, which were not far from where I lived in Knoxville, Tennessee at the time. And I go sit on a rock or something, a piece of wood. And I just decided I was going to sit there until I heard an answer. And so I do. And the answer is no. And I'm like, wait, no?
That's not the answer I wanted.
I came here looking for an answer, not that.
Not that answer.
So it turns out that because I had by that point learned a little bit about moving with the Spirit, I decided to go with that. And it was very difficult to explain to my family and friends who were like, "You're going to turn down a job."
Supposed to be going up.
You have a job, but you're turning down a job that you would really want, and you don't have any offers in sight. So, and you're not happy. So what is that? So I said, I don't know. I'm just gonna go with that. So fast forward 5 years, I'm sitting in the office of my surgeon, transplant surgeon, who explains to me that, he was explaining the surgery, but he said, well, I'm glad you're not on the East Coast. And I said, well, why is that? He said, well, there's a lot of centers vying for the same organs. I'm not sure if you would make it. I was actually living in Colorado, and at the time, I think the next transplant center was UCLA. So it made all the difference in the world for me, without understanding it, to just go with the Spirit with the no.
Yes.
And take that job in Colorado, and here I am.
Right. You may very well have not gotten a heart had you taken that job.
Yeah.
Right. And there were many, and since that time, there have been many situations in which I have gotten a sense, or I have taken something into the silence, and like doctor wanted to do electrical ablation on me, and every time I took it in the silence, it was like no, no, and no. Right?
Yeah.
But at the same time, I had to have a valve replacement, and I kept hearing, you need to go to the doctor. You need to go to the doctor. So I go to the doctors and I say, hey, I've had this kidney transplant, but I still seem to be retaining fluids. What's up with that? And they said, well, we might need to fix that leaking valve. Leaking valve. Okay.
Hello. Yeah.
And I said, well, so how do we determine when it's the right time? And they said, well, maybe when you can't take it anymore. And what does that mean, right? That I fall out.
Startling.
Right?
Yeah.
So I said, well, is there any more objective criteria?
Yes.
They said, well, yeah, if water is backing up, fluid's backing up on your liver. So I said, well, can we test for that? And they said, well, yeah, we can do an abdominal ultrasound. They do the ultrasound, and then they call me ready to schedule the surgery.
Wow.
And the surgeon in that case basically said, I'm glad you came in, because if you had waited much longer, I don't think I could have fixed that.
Wow. Gosh. So here's the follow-up on that, I guess, is, because my wife, Catherine Ann, sees God in all these things that happen, and I go, oh God, here we go again. This is all God, right? Because this pops up in front of us. She's far more, oh, we lost Rob. He'll return, I'm sure. So she will see these things and sort of, this means something. And I can be a little more cynical. You point out in the book, and you do this in every chapter, which I really like, is you point out what the cautions, so to speak. So I wonder if you can say a word or two about the caution of not everything being, somehow divinely ordained,
Right. Yeah. Sometimes people think, I'm not going to give medication to my sick child because, God will intervene, or, we could go through the list. I think that if there's anything that I've learned from writing this book and it being reaffirmed, is that we must listen to the Spirit, particularly about any major decisions.
Yeah.
Because sometimes the decisions that we make are not of the Spirit. They're of, our desires, or for something, or an experience, etc. And that it's really important to have that connection and to have that kind of continuous interaction with Spirit. And that comes from that cultivation of listening on a regular basis. Wow. So, all right, you start out with, maybe a couple of minutes of silence in the morning, but, you can stop at any point in the day, or you can stop. Occasionally I will pause because there's so many things going on, and I'll say, Spirit, what is it that you want me to do next? Yeah. And I can hear immediately, or no, it's not even about hearing. It's it's a knowingness.
It's a knowing, isn't it? It's something deeper than that. Yes. It's deeper than hearing even.
Yes. Because it doesn't always come in words. I mean, I always say my emergencies, I have to hear words, right? Like, you need to do this right now. But typically basically, it's a knowingness.
Yeah. Sometimes it's like you can feel it in your bones.
Yes.
You know?
Yes. Well, that mystical experience that I described, I
Yeah.
said there was a presence in the room and I
Yeah.
could feel the answers in my body.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
It's
very
like I was
somatic,
feeling
right?
them.
It's like
Yes.
it's yeah, it's amazing. This next one sort of touches a little bit on that conversation you had about Thurman's grandmother. Just a second here. We're going to let Rob back in. For those of you watching this, if you've seen Rob disappear and reappear, it's because he had a power outage apparently. So I think Rob is going to be joining us again, and we'll see what Ian does with all. There he is. He's back, folks. Back from the power outage of 2023 is Rob.
I don't know what
Henderson.
happened. I just disappeared. Everybody went away.
I'll tell you, Lerita's eyes went the size of saucers. It's like, holy moly, he's been taken up in the rapture. If I believed in such a thing,
right.
you're God in the rapture. Sad for me and Lerita because we were so-called left behinds. So.
You were left behind. That's right. See?
Anyway, I was just starting to ask Lerita about this business of Thurman's grandmother, who, you had mentioned that piece that he taught her, that she taught him, pardon me, about, being a child of God. And you also write about inner resolve. And that's really where I want to take this is Thurman writes this: there is in every person an inward sea, and in that sea there is an island, and on that island there is an altar, and standing guard before that altar is the angel with the flaming sword. Nothing can get by that angel to be placed upon that altar unless it has the mark of your inner authority. Nothing passes the angel with the flaming sword to be placed upon your altar unless it be a part of the fluid area of your consent. This is your crucial link with the eternal. In writing about inner authority, you share about your mother and her resolve. And how important your mother's resolve was in your own life and how that modeled something for you. She taught me, you write, to ignore men who thought women were inferior and to deflect verbal attacks that might dampen my aspirations. She showed me how to respond to people who held a certain social convention about race and gender or presumed I wasn't intelligent because of my skin color. You point out that Jesus taught that no matter how repressive external circumstances become, as children of God, we are each created with that inner sanctuary. And we need to protect it, which I really like that language of protecting our inner sanctuary because it's like it's assailed on all sides. Tell us about your mother and about her witness to you on how to protect that sanctuary.
Oh, my mother's just such a, in some ways appeared to be just this kind of sweet woman, but there was that side of her that was not willing to allow someone to disrespect her in that way. And in that particular incident that I wrote about in the book, I probably couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 years old. My mother grew up in part of the time in Hot Springs, Arkansas. But she spent from the time, I would say from age 9 or so in California, with her father. And so I think she had a sense that there was a certain way that things could or should operate. So what happened was we walked into regular store, Walmart or something like that. At the time, it was not that at the time, but retail store, and a white woman came up to us and said, well, how y'all girls doing today? Well, she's talking to me and my mother. And of course, to refer to a Black woman as a girl was, the way in which people, did in that time. So my mother just looked at her and just turned around and walked out the store. And I'm like looking at the candy thing saying, wait, what, are we leaving?
Yeah.
But I got it.
Right.
I got it. And I think that there were other ways in which she would model this idea of there's just a line where, once people sort of cross that line, it's just not okay.
Right.
She wanted the very best for us. I used to call her a Norman Vincent Peale cheerleader on the side. But and she had her own struggles. I mean, she spent some time living in Hot Springs as an adult, and learning how to be what I don't even know how to describe this for people now, because she would have been a PBX operator. And this is way before anything that any of people now can imagine, that you had to connect calls, that came into a business. But she couldn't get a job like that in Pasadena. She could see, we would read the advertisement in the newspaper, and she'd go apply for the job, and they'd say, well, it's been filled. And so then the next day the job would be back in the newspaper.
Right.
So, she did have her moments where it was, it was hard to see that. As well as with my father, who fought in World War II and came back to a segregated South.
Yeah, that is fascinating to me. Like in terms of American history, especially, we had it here in Canada too, with particularly our Indigenous folks who went overseas, fought in the name of Canada, and came back in Canada. They weren't considered people. So they go fight for Canada and come back, and they could not vote because they weren't citizens of the country.
Right.
We're talking in the 50s, So yeah, for your dad too. I mean, so how does someone like your dad, someone like your mom, someone like Howard Thurman and you, how do we protect that belovedness, that we know we're God's beloved, right? And that sword of protection to keep away, because there are so many voices out there, so much noise telling us that we're not good enough, that we're not smart enough, we're not rich enough, we're not fancy enough, we're too fat, we're not, and all the racial stuff. And nowadays with the younger generation, so much pressure to measure up. So protecting that inner resolve, how do you get there, Lerita? Like, how does it,
So I think Thurman started with the Negro spirituals. So you had these songs, this poetic prose come out of people who were struggling, right? And he would think, wow, if these people who are enslaved could hold on through a song, or produce a song that they can hold on to, it's almost as if it becomes a transcendent experience for them. In the case of my parents, they were both very much members of predominantly Black churches. And again, I think the church played an instrumental role in much of that. I think my mother was probably a little more spiritual than my father was. And so she was she would read this inspirational material, whether it was from the Unity Church or the Bible or whatever. I mean, she read, widely. So I think she was getting some of her support from those. But in some ways, I think Thurman would say, first, you've got to become aware of who you are. You've got to develop an accurate portrayal of who you are. And this sort of led him much later in one of his last addresses to talk about waiting and listening for the genuine in you. Right. And the genuine in others. So that it's almost as if you're getting all this stuff as if it's been piled on you. Right. And you're starting to peel those layers of stuff off.
Right.
And some of us are lucky. I would say that I was lucky because I attended an integrated Catholic school from first grade on. And the nuns were like, God loved all of you. Right? I'm not sure if all of them loved all of us.
God loves you, but I got a ruler.
Pretty much. But what it did was it allowed me not to associate, say, for instance, intelligence with race.
Right.
I had some really smart kids in my class, and I had some kids that were not so smart. And they were, of every variety of Catholic you can think. Right? White, Black, Latinx, South Asian, and just anybody who happened to be Catholic. And so I didn't develop that association. I was a very precocious child. And so at some point, I started noticing that people would try to project their stuff onto me, whether it's a man or a person who, has, some racist tendencies, or what I tend to see is what I call white surprise. I have this name for it. Where, for example, I was teaching, I'm not sure which school it was, maybe University of Michigan. And one day, and somebody came into my office, I had this white female student sitting on the floor, and they walk in and they look at her and say, "Professor Coleman?"
Jeez, yeah. Oh
Of
my
course,
God.
of
Yeah,
course.
Of course.
Or
White,
on the
oh, you're black.
or on the first day of class, I would do this exercise on purpose where I would have the students pick out Professor Coleman out of the audience.
Lovely.
They
I
never-
love this.
They never
This,
That's amazing.
I just love you. That is
Yeah.
incredible. I
That's
can't help
great.
but think of America's Lovable Bigot, Archie Bunker. Remember those episodes?
Yeah.
And, and there's that
right.
great episode where he finds himself locked in the cellar and he gets ossified on the booze that's down there, and he starts praying to Jesus to save him. And the insurance man comes by, and he's African American, and he hears him calling out for help in the basement, and he opens the door and he comes down the stairs, and Archie is praying, and he looks up and he's got white surprise because he looks at this African American insurance man and he goes, "Forgive me, Jesus, I didn't know." Right. But it's that white surprise. So I mean, there again, like these are things as a cisgender white dude I don't ever have to worry about, right? I don't have to think about these things. But the notion that you would be in a institution of higher learning like University of Michigan or wherever else, and have to think about whether or not the person knows you're the professor simply because you might be A, a woman, or B, African American. Like, really? I mean, yeah. And so having that inner resolve, because I mean, that can be crushing.
It can be crushing to certain people.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
But I think that again, for me, I've had this connection to the spirit since I was young.
Yeah.
Clearly.
And so it's almost as if it has walked with me.
Yeah.
And and because of my training in psychology, I realized people project a whole bunch of stuff.
Oh yeah.
You're not kidding.
No,
And it has nothing to do with you.
No,
Right.
Yeah.
And so there are days, on my better days, it does nothing.
Right.
On my not so good days, I might have to go in the room and shut the door.
Oh yeah. Totally. Yeah.
But I have found by moving with spirit, which, by the way, I nicknamed Spirit Sophia. I figured
that's a good name. Yeah.
feminine energy on that.
She's incredible.
Right. So I have found that with Sophia, anytime anybody put an obstacle, sometimes due to race or gender, whatever, in my way, she would show me a way around it.
Right.
Okay. Yeah.
So you get denied tenure here, but then there's this other place opening up.
What's going on? Yeah.
Or you turn this job down over here,
right?
But she gives you, she sends somebody with another one.
That's right.
Yeah.
So that, and if people could get that,
yes, amazing.
Yeah. And be aware and see that. We want to, just in the last few minutes we have with you, want to talk about walking the path of liberating spirituality. And again, I'd like to offer a short quote from your book where you write, some of us used to attend to our spiritual selves, but have recently ignored them. Others have never fully explored them. And some of us were handed a spirituality by parents or churches that we tried on for a while, but that never seemed to fit or even felt damaging. And here we are, more than 40 years after Thurman's death, still locked in our private cells of political, social, religious tribalism, narcissism.
Wow, yeah.
Clearly, the infrastructure of our current spirituality is in dire need of repair, lest it implode. So how might we envision a spirituality that forms bridges instead of builds barriers, bridges that we can walk across into community, the common unity that Thurman believed we all share? What structural supports, guardrails, roads are needed to lead us to an awareness of oneness? What materials will fortify and maintain a reconstructed spirituality? A great gift of question to give us and communities. A restructured spirituality, it must be liberating, right? For both the oppressed and the oppressor. And you're right that for Thurman, much of Christian dogma corrupted the true message of Jesus. And any religion that supports the exploitation of any part of God's beloved creation is misguided. And the unwillingness to consider or acknowledge the interconnection of all people fuels much of the injustice in the world. So to wrap things up today, can you say maybe more to us about how we might, pick up on the gauntlet that he threw down and carry it forward ourselves? How do we embrace that sacred activism as a response to Thurman, this wonderful man whose writings were well ahead of their time?
Oh, yes. First, I think that people need to pay attention to their spiritual lives.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of emphasis on, one thing that happens frequently with me as a spiritual director companion is one of the first questions I ask people when they come to me is, tell me something about your spiritual life. And the first thing they say, you mean the last time I went to church?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So they don't even have a conception of what a spiritual life might be.
Right.
And then the second thing is I might ask them, well, so tell me something about your prayer life.
Mm-hmm.
They're like, well, I'm really kind of busy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I think the first, it's, with all these things, you've got to have a foundation, right? If you want to restructure or reconstitute spirituality. And part of the problem is that we basically have ignored the spiritual life in many churches
Mm-hmm.
and individually. So it's not just the church's fault, right? But I think as more and more people choose to cultivate their spirits, right? Just like, they're concerned about their health or if they're exercising enough, if they're eating the right foods, how much time are you giving to your spiritual life?
Right.
Is it just on Sunday for a couple hours?
Yeah.
Or are you engaged in some way with spirit on a regular and daily basis? Are you aware of how you can fortify your inward center,
Mm-hmm.
as we talked about in inner authority,
Mm-hmm.
and are engaging with inner authority, capital I, capital A?
Right.
Spirit's always available to help us if we would just be open.
Exactly.
So number one, I think as individuals, we need to start paying much more attention to what kind of spiritual life do we have and how does that manifest on a daily basis.
Mm-hmm.
And then second, as we are able to do that, we can take that into whatever communities that we belong to that would then begin to create places and spaces for people to develop a spiritual life of a community, right? And one of the things that Thurman talks about, he tried to move us away from the term mysticism and more into creative encounter or religious experience.
Mm-hmm.
But he writes in the creative encounter that every time that you have that connection with the presence, it should change you from the inside.
Mm.
And it should stir something in you that's already there that is yearning for oneness and for wholeness.
Right.
And that's where you begin to look out of yourself, but you're living from inside, but looking out of yourself to what's in the way.
Right.
What are the humanly imposed barriers that are keeping me from this oneness?
Right.
In whatever domain that might be, whether it's the natural domain or other people.
Mm.
Yeah.
And then with regard to sacred activism, I differentiate activism from sacred activism by suggesting that when you invite spirit in to provide the guidance for your activism, it becomes sacred.
Mm.
And I personally now believe that spirit was at work long before Martin Luther King Jr. was born, like starting these connections, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And setting up the circumstances so that you see elements of Thurman's center down.
Yes.
And find that peace within before you walk out into what might be violent confrontation.
Right.
So I think it's important for us to start with our own responsibility, as to what we're doing in our own spiritual lives, and then to begin to allow that to seep into some of these institutions that if they're not sort of making some changes are going to disappear.
And I think that sort of minds down to your title in a way, and that quote of Thurman's, right, where that you see on everything now, which is, don't ask what the world needs, ask what makes you come alive, and go do that, because that's what the world needs, more people who have come alive. And I think, we started, I quipped about Stacey Abrams, right? Like, I think that's a good example. Like, I think that her faith, her own spirituality, her own sense of her belovedness, her ability to protect her inner, that inner authority, has driven her, and she's come up against, injustice and defeat and all that stuff without succumbing to that, right? To continue to sort of, she knows what makes her come alive, and she continues, to just continue to persist. I mean, it's amazing to me.
To me, it's the key to inner freedom.
Yeah.
And people that knew Thurman said he was probably the freest person they knew.
Liberated. Yeah.
Yes. He's liberated from all the stuff, all the expectations, all of the dogma, all of this other stuff that has, is out there, to walk with the Spirit, right? So that's how you live in the world, but not be overcome by it.
Yeah, because if you can take that thing that makes you feel alive, and that's the thing that you do, then it becomes much easier to battle the rest of the crap, because you're not trying to measure by somebody else's standard or do something for I'm just trying to improve my community, all this. No, it's what makes you feel come alive, that you're coming alive,
Find that. Find that.
Yes.
Well,
absolutely.
we've been absolutely gifted to have you here today. So thank you so much. Again, the book, What Makes You Come Alive, A Spiritual Walk, with Howard Thurman, and Lerita Coleman Brown's been our guest on the Vickers Crossing. Thank you so much for all your work and your ministry, and for sharing this time with us today. There's the book right there.
Thank you. I've enjoyed the conversation. It's been great.
Well, what a great conversation
Awesome.
that was. I've learned so much, and can't wait to get my hands on maybe some more of Thurman's writings.
Yes.
I've just read some of it, but I know there's a lot more out there, and I hope our listeners do too. This is a great, we're talking about moving toward liberation. Great time to be talking about this and reading about this in Lent, as we
That's right.
move toward that, the liberation and of Easter Sunday coming. And so, hey, we want to thank our sponsors today on the Vickers Crossing, to A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London Middlesex, both family owned and operated. To the Diocese of Huron, supporting us here at the Vickers Crossing. The Diocese of Huron, a community where families and individuals from Windsor to Owen Sound, Grand Bend to Port Rowan come together to worship and to serve. And to Molly Maid, make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today.
Yes, sirree. And shout out to producer Ian, wherever he went. We got to see him. What did you say to Ian last week, that he just disappeared?
I don't know. I must have insulted him somehow.
I just don't understand it. I mean, it's like he was here and now he's not. I
don't know.
Anyway, well, folks, say a prayer out there that Ian returns to us sometime soon. In the meantime, I know he'll be with you, because he will have fixed this up to get it out to your eyeballs, and your ears. So,
and your earballs too.
Yes. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Thanks everybody for being here. Thanks to Lerita for joining us. And until we get together again, Kevin, remember to always look both ways
before you cross the street.
Thank you for listening. Our hosts are Kevin George and Rob Henderson. Our producer and composer is myself, Ian, with original artwork done by Elizabeth Dodman. If you have any questions or want to know where to find us, tweet us at Vickers Crossing, or find us on Facebook at The Vickers Crossing. If you have any other questions about anything heard on this podcast, leave us a comment or look in the description to find out more. Thanks!